Hello and welcome back. For the topic of this video, we're going to be discussing another one of the world's most famous philosophers. In fact, had a tremendous impact, just like Plato did, on everyone who was to come after him. This man's name is Aristotle. Aristotle lived from about 384 to 322 BC. And he has the notoriety, or he's well known for being the student of Plato. Plato, of course, started the academy and had a number of brilliant young philosophers who came and joined the academy and learned from him. None was more brilliant, at least none remembered as more brilliant than the man who is known today as Aristotle. Was known then as well as Aristotle. He studied under Plato early on in life, and then something happened when Plato passed away, or before he did. When Plato named his heir, who would take over the academy after him, many people thought, including Aristotle, that it would go to his brightest star of a pupil, that being Aristotle, of course. However, Plato passed the administration of the academy on to a nephew of his, or a relation of some sort, and then went and passed away. And Aristotle was kind of put out by this, and so he went in and started his own school that was known as the Lyceum, and he began to teach there. Now, it may be the fact that Plato was very committed to his own philosophy, and Aristotle, although he was brilliant and very bright, nonetheless disagreed fundamentally with the conclusions of his teacher Plato, whereas Plato it had a more sort of rationalist bent at knowing knowledge. Aristotle took the empiricist route, and as such that affected the rest of his philosophy and how he thought about things, and more or less disagreed with his master, his teacher, on a good number of things. Well, anyway, he was famous for having studied under Plato. Later in life, King Philip of Macedon sought out Aristotle and put him in the employ to tutor his son, the young prince Alexander. And of course, Alexander would then go on and be Alexander the Great, and was known world over for conquering most of the world that he knew about in that day. He made his way around the Mediterranean Sea and then back up into Persia and all the way to India, where his generals decided they didn't want to fight mounted troops on elephants, and that's where his conquest ended. Went back home, made it almost all the way back home, and ended up dying. And his kingdom was divided up among his 4 generals. But anyway, Alexander the Great was the pupil of Aristotle. He was tutored by Aristotle at a young age. Other things that Aristotle is well known for, perhaps more than anything, his greatest contribution comes from his systemization of logic. The systemization of logic. Aristotle understood that there were patterns in canons or laws by which we reason, and by which we teach, and by which we talk. And so he set about trying to discern what were those laws by which we think, by which we reason. This was recorded in his writings on logic, and by the way, his writings on logic are still among the most well-known treatises on the subject today. In other words, Aristotelian logic is still present and taught in many places today. So if you can come up with a philosophy that has over 2,000 years of staying power, you've probably come upon a pretty good thing, and Aristotle certainly was one who has done that. Now, there was a lot of his other stuff that really was kind of out there. Of course, he was trying to make observations with the naked eye without any sort of technology to aid him in that. And so a lot of his things on zoology or physics, what he called physics, really don't line up with what we know to be true today. But his system of logic is second to none, even today. He also is known for trying to get at what is the cause of a thing, and causality is a thing that he wrote on. He also put together a system of virtue ethics that we'll look at, and so forth. So well known in he was very, very multi-talented, had many different applications of his abilities, and was a very versatile philosopher. Well, let's dive right in. The first thing I want us to look at with Aristotle is his empiricism. His empiricism. Now, if you recall the first day of class when we talked about what do philosophers study, we took a look at epistemology. Now, epistemology is the idea that is the study of knowledge and what we know and how we can say that we have knowledge and so forth. Aristotle is an empiricist. He's not the first empiricist. He certainly is not the last one, but he is of the empiricist school. And so I want to talk a little bit about what Aristotle taught on empiricism, his particular brand of it. Generically speaking, empiricism is a belief system that says that the best way to arrive at knowledge is through sense experience. Empiricism, of course, the word refers to your empirical senses, your sense of sight, smell, hearing, tasting, touching, and so forth. So Aristotle, like many many other empiricists, believed that a person started out life in this world and their mind was a blank slate, and experience would come and write on that blank slate in order to help us to gain knowledge about the world we live in, about ourselves, and pretty much about everything. Now, he does retain the use of the word form, like Plato did, and in a broad sense, he means roughly the same thing in terms of what the concept of the form accomplishes or functions as. Now, Plato, however, if you recall, Plato believed in two different worlds: the world of matter and the world of form. The world of the forms is the world that gave meaning. It was an ideal world. In other words, it did not have a physical existence. It was not material in nature. The world of the forms, according to Plato, was a world of ideas. A form was an idea that gave meaning to a lump of matter. So, for example, this lump of matter, this is a coffee mug, and this mug is made out of, I would imagine, clay or ceramic of some sort. And but this isn't just any clay or ceramic. This mug has been fashioned, or this particular lump of matter, this particular lump of clay and ceramic has been fashioned in such a way that it will fulfill a purpose. And so it has a handle that's part of the form, and the cup there that holds the liquid that gets poured into it. That is all part of the form of this. So it has matter plus form, and that equals the coffee mug. Now, Aristotle disagreed with Plato. Plato thought that the form of the cup was something that existed, the ideal coffee cup. It exists out in the world of ideas, and the person who went and made this coffee cup accessed that world of ideas and created this mug after the form that he knew of in his mind. And so he put this mug together according to that form. Aristotle disagrees. Aristotle believes that the form of the mug is actually in the object itself. You see, Aristotle was more concerned. He believed that the meaning of this mug is inherent to the mug. It's not in some disconnected world out there somewhere. It is not even subjectively in each one of our minds, but the form of the thing is in the thing itself. Now, he believed that, and since he believed that the form of a thing is in the thing itself, this led Aristotle to paying more attention to the things in the world, to try to get at their meaning. So instead of trying to reason to this perfect form of a cup in his mind, no, he would look at the object itself, examine it, look around it, weigh it, measure it, try to find out as much data as he could about the object, and derive the object's form from that. The form is inherent in the object itself. This led him to look at the world more than to try to reason his way to some transcendent form. So that's why he's an empiricist. Empiricism is basically the idea that you're gaining knowledge through your five senses, and he uses his five senses to interact with objects and try to divine their form, out of that. So that's his big break from Plato. Plato, who's a rationalist who believes that our knowledge of the transcendent world of the forms is something that we're born with and that we have to remember. Remember, Plato believed that all knowledge is remembering. And so Aristotle says, no, all knowledge is gained from the external world. It's not accessing the world of the forms. That is the beginning and the main difference between Plato and Aristotle. Now, how does Aristotle's empiricism work? You see, because we still have to have an idea in our mind that gives meaning to things. And if all that we have is the world of matter, then how do we arrive at meaning? How can we assign meaning to those things? Well, Aristotle believes that your empirical senses work through a twofold process of induction and intuition. Induction and intuition. So these are two steps that your mind goes through in learning and experiencing the things in this world. So induction is the process of gathering information about the world through the five senses. So this is the way that you employ sight and sound, or hearing, and taste and smell and touch, and you interact with the things outside of your mind in this world, the external objects. You interact with those things in the world, and you gain knowledge based on your experience and your interaction with those things. That's what is called induction. We experience the world, and the more experience that we gain, our mind sort of puts these experiences together in order to create generalizations whereby we can recognize things. So, for example, I've seen many different kinds of automobiles. But let's say, I'll give you an example. So I've seen a pickup truck, and I have seen a Jeep. This last year, Jeep came out with the Gladiator, the Jeep Gladiator. And so anyway, I saw a Jeep Gladiator driving down the road, and if you don't know what that is, a Jeep Gladiator looks like a Jeep Wrangler in the front, and it kind of looks like, and then it has a pickup truck bed in the back. Now, I had never seen one of those before, but I knew what it was because my mind had seen a Jeep. I'd seen with my eyes. I'd seen a Jeep. I'd seen many pickup trucks as well with my eyes. So that when I saw this new vehicle that I had never seen before, my mind had made a generalization from prior experience that allowed me to interpret what was presently in front of me. Well, our mind does that all the time. Aristotle believes, and as we grow older, we gain more experience in the world, our mind makes those generalizations more readily. And so it picks up on the world around us and makes those generalizations that allows us to interpret things maybe that we have never experienced before. Now, the second part of this process is that of intuition. Intuition is the process that we go through in order to become aware of mathematical truths or truths of logic. You see, first, what might be known as first principles or mathematical truths of logic. Those things we don't see. I mean, we don't see 1 + 1 = 2. Now, we can take one object here and one object here, put them together and count 2, but we don't see the concept behind it that 1 + 1 = 2. And we don't see those mathematical laws. We cannot sense them in any way. We can express them in the world that we live in, and in that way we can kind of experience them, but we cannot sense them directly using our empirical senses. But Aristotle realizes that we have knowledge about these things. So how do we get it? Well, intuition is a process whereby the mind begins to make logical jumps or make sort of rational guesses, if you will, and we recognize these things even if we cannot directly experience them. So intuition is a process of the mind whereby we kind of come to a knowledge of laws of logic, like the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, the law of the excluded middle, and so forth. We are aware of those logical processes. We use them instinctively almost
That's our intuition. That's what Aristotle would refer to as our intuition. So induction and intuition. Induction allows us to generalize about things. Intuition allows us to know and understand mathematics and logical processes. Experience is how we feed information into our mind in this whole process, and that's how our mind comes by knowledge. Induction and intuition. Now, moving on from there, we've already mentioned a little bit about logic earlier on in the semester, earlier on in this class. But suffice it to say that Aristotle systematized the logic in a way that no one previous to him had done. He was really the first. Now people had used logical systems all along, and they sort of have intuitively utilized them throughout the history of philosophy before Aristotle. Aristotle really was the first one to sit back and think about the process of thinking itself. And then he began to formulate laws that we adhere to when we think. And those are called the laws of logic. Now, it's important to stress that Aristotle did not invent logic. Logic is not an invention. It's a process that we follow in order to think about the world. Many today would talk about, he wrote it down and so he invented it. Logic is not an invented thing. It's an aspect of the universe that we use to determine truth, or to actually not necessarily to determine truth, but at least to ferret out falsehoods. Okay, so logic is a system of laws and rules, processes that we follow whenever we think and whenever we're thinking well or thinking correctly. The thing that I would stress about Aristotle is that he did not invent logic. He simply discovered and articulated and wrote down the processes by which it works. And that system of logic is still in use today. It's still something that we utilize whenever we go to think or talk or communicate or anything like that. So his contribution to logic is well known. The next thing that I should mention about Aristotle has to do with his metaphysics, his view of substance, his view of reality. Now, the word substance is a word that is a technical term among many philosophers. Many philosophers have an idea of what is substance. And substances basically are the things that the universe is made of. And that definition holds pretty solidly for every philosopher. But the one thing that I would point out is this: there is much disagreement on what substance or substances make up the universe. There are some, like Aristotle and Gottfried Leibniz and others, who will say that there are many different substances that make up the universe. Whereas there are others, like, for example, Baruch Spinoza, who will say that there's only one substance, that all things are one substance. And each thinker has their own explanation for why they think what they believe is the correct answer. But Aristotle believes that there are many substances, actually. Substance for Aristotle equals matter plus form. So here, let me get my handy coffee mug here again. So matter plus form. So this coffee mug is made of matter. And the matter is simply the materials that make up the coffee mug. So matter is part of the equation for what constitutes a substance. This is, like I said, made out of clay or ceramic, has some kind of glaze on it. I'm not sure exactly the processes behind it, but the material components that go into making this coffee mug a coffee mug, that's the matter that it's made of. In addition to the matter, though, this coffee mug has a form, and it's the form of a coffee mug. It's not the form of a tire. It's not the form of a doorknob. It's not the form of a window. It's the form of a coffee mug. It fulfills the purpose that a coffee mug was intended to fill, and so that's what it does. It makes a terrible hammer because it's not a hammer. So in substance, this is a mug. It has the matter that is made of, and it has the form that is the idea that goes into forming it. So matter plus form is a substance, according to Aristotle. And by that definition alone, you can see that there are many different substances throughout the world. There are many different, each individual object is going to be a substance in its own, because it is composed by a distinct mass of matter, and it has its own particular form. So every object is a substance in and of itself, and so there are many trillions of different substances that make up the world, according to Aristotle. Now, all of these substances do have some things in common, though, and this is something that is very important to understand with Aristotle. And it holds true for many of the empiricists as well, not all of them, but certainly here's what Aristotle, this is what Aristotle's version says. Substances are material objects. Aristotle is a materialist. He believes that the world can be explained by the matter that it contains, and all phenomenon can be explained in terms of those things. But substances, there may be one exception to that, which we'll talk about shortly. But substances are material objects. So everything is made of matter, has a form, therefore it's a substance. Substances are material objects, according to Aristotle. He believes also that substances are external to our mind. Now, what this means is that the substance, like this coffee mug that I keep coming back to, this coffee mug does not exist in my mind. Now, this coffee mug causes my mind to have impressions of it. Because the light coming off of it, I can see it, the weight of it, I can feel the texture, I can feel how hot or cold it is, I can feel that as well. And so this coffee mug causes impressions in my mind, but those impressions are not the thing itself. The mug itself is external to my mind. And so the substance of this thing is outside of my mind. Now, it is a material object, it's external to my mind, but as I said before, this substance causes sensations in our mind. And there is a direct correlation. This is the important part for Aristotle. There is a direct correlation between the substance that is outside of my mind and the sensations that it causes inside of my mind, these sensations of perception, if you will. So I'm sensing a mug that is smooth in texture because the substance of the mug is actually smooth in texture. I'm sensing a roundness in the mug because the mug itself is actually round. And so the properties that I sense in my mind have a direct correlation with the substance of this object itself. Now, there are some philosophers who will deny that, and then there are some philosophers who will challenge that. Who will say, yes, it does in some cases, but not all cases. I wanted to make clear that that's not always something that we could take for granted among philosophers. But for Aristotle, there is a one-to-one correlation between the object itself and the sensation that it causes in our mind. So he is a materialist in terms of his metaphysics. He believes that there are many substances, and he believes that those substances cause sensations in our mind. Now, let's talk about substance in reality. Substance in reality. Aristotle believes that this is a coffee mug, and this coffee mug has a form in itself. Okay, the coffee mug has a form of a coffee mug, and but there are certain qualities in this coffee mug that are not necessarily essential in order to have the form of a coffee mug. Okay, so there are some things in the coffee mug that this coffee mug has that every coffee mug has. For example, it has the ability to hold liquid of some sort. Every good coffee mug, I should say. It has the ability to hold liquid, and usually, since you're putting hot liquid in a coffee mug, most coffee mugs will have a handle that is not on the mug itself, because then you can avoid burning your hand, when the mug heats up. I don't know if you've ever been outside on a cold day and you pour some hot liquid in a cup, and sometimes you'll see people holding on to it and blowing it, and so they can get their hands warmed up or whatnot. Well, the handle is here so that you don't have to burn your hand, you don't have to get the warmth coming out. So those things things are essential, really, to this coffee mug being a coffee mug. If it doesn't have those things, then it's not really a coffee mug, at least not a good one. So but this coffee mug is also white in color, okay? Is that necessary to being a coffee mug, being white in color? Well, certainly not. There are many different colors of coffee mugs. There are many different, even multicolored coffee mugs with printing on them, coffee mugs with pictures on them, and so on. So the color of this coffee mug is not necessary to the form of a coffee mug. The form of the thing, those necessary qualities are the things that make it what it is. The unnecessary qualities of this particular coffee mug are the qualities that it has, but that are not necessary for it to be a coffee mug. So that's a distinction to make in the form of this thing, because the form of this particular mug does include the color white, but that is an unnecessary quality. It doesn't have to be white in order to be a coffee mug. That's just a little distinction to make there when we're talking about forms, because the form, as we look around at different things, we recognize. So, for example, for an automobile to be an automobile, it needs to have 4 tires, or a car to be a car, rather. It needs to have 4 tires. They have a general shape to them. They have seats, a steering wheel, gas pedal, brake pedal. Some of them have a clutch. And so all of these things are different qualities of an automobile. And therefore, when we see those necessary qualities in an object, our mind automatically goes to automobile. The color of it is incidental. And sometimes the shape of it is incidental. But there are qualities that make a thing what they are, and then there are qualities that are just superficial, and they are not necessary to make a thing what it is. Okay, so those are some things about Aristotle's metaphysic, at least as it relates to substance and form. The next thing I want to look at with Aristotle is his study into the realm of causality. Aristotle believed that all things have a cause, and as he looks around into the world, again, he's one of these guys who likes to look around the world, investigate. He likes to gather data and just see how things operate in the world. And one of the things that he notices is that everything has a cause. Everything that he sees, everything that he experiences, everything that in this world that he sees around him has a cause. In other words, it can be explained in terms of something else. It has a cause. And Aristotle breaks it down to, he wonders about causality, and he breaks the concept of causality into 4 distinct categories of causes that can explain a thing. For example, the first type of cause that Aristotle articulates, the first one he talks about, is that of the material cause. And the material cause of a thing is basically the materials or the things that go into making it. So it's when you can explain a thing by referring to what it's made of. And so if you think of an automobile, you think of steel and aluminum and glass and rubber and plastic, cloth and foam and things like this. The car has many material components. And so that would be said, those material components would be said to be that thing's material cause. It explains the object in terms of what it is composed of, what it's made of. After the material cause, Aristotle believes in what is known as an efficient cause. Now, when we explain things, when we talk about a thing, we do oftentimes refer to its material cause, what it's made out of. We also refer many times to a thing's efficient cause. An efficient cause explains a thing in reference to who or what caused it to come into being, who created it, who made it. And so if we're talking about a Ford, if I'm talking about my truck, then you could say, well, Ford is responsible. Ford is the efficient cause of it because the Ford Motor Company may have put it together, right? If we're talking about any kind of object, every kind of object has an efficient cause. It can be explained in terms of what it is made of. So there's the material cause, the efficient cause, and the next one is what is known as the formal cause. The formal cause seeks to explain a thing in reference to its form. And remember, the form is sort of the big idea that defines or explains what a thing is. So a formal cause explains a thing in terms of its form, rather. So if we look at the same vehicle, I would say it's a truck because it has the form of a truck. I'm not going into an explanation of what all the particulars are, what kind of engine it has, what kind of transmission, what's it geared at, what's the gear ratio on it, what size of bed or anything like that. I'm just going at this point and saying it has the form of a truck, and so when you look at it, you can tell that it's a truck because it has that form, that general makeup, that build of a truck. So there's the material cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and then there's the final cause. The final cause really gets at something of what Aristotle believes about the nature of reality. You see, because Aristotle believes that all things have a purpose, and the word that he would use for that is a telos. Everything is teleological. It has a purpose. And so a final cause explains a thing in terms of the purpose that it fulfills. And Aristotle believes that everything, whether it's been man-made or whether it's found in nature, everything has a purpose. All things have a final cause. And so he says a final cause is an explanation of what a thing's purpose is. So there's the material cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. And those are the four aspects of causation or causality that Aristotle would articulate. Now, Aristotle also, in terms of axiology, or value, the study of value, or the study of meaning, in terms of the study of meaning, Aristotle believes that there is meaning in the universe. There is a telos, there is a purpose for all things. And so where does this purpose, where does it come from? Now, Aristotle, of course, lived in the 4th century BC. He lived in ancient Greece. And of course, his culture would have been very familiar with things like with personages like Zeus or Apollos or Hades or Hermes or any other number of deities, Poseidon and others, and he would have been very well acquainted with the gods. However, Aristotle, following the pattern of some philosophers of his day, really kind of broke ranks and didn't mention the gods too much because they really didn't figure into natural philosophy so much. Now, some I guess exceptions to that might be the idea that they provide for justice and things like this. However, he was not quick to appeal to the gods as an explanation for anything. However, he did realize something. He did realize that there has to be a first cause for all things. You will recall when Aristotle was talking about the four various different kinds of causes, the whole reason that he was into studying this sort of thing is because he believed that all things have a cause. In fact, when he looked around, everything had a cause, which led him to sort of a conundrum, a problem that he had in his mind. Because if all things are caused, then how can anything start it off? If everything that we see in the world around us is caused, how can anything in the world around us be the initiator of all of these causes? And so he developed his understanding of God as a first cause. Now, to illustrate basically what he's talking about here, is that the material world that we live in, it seems to be a closed system. All things in this world are explainable by other things that we can point to in this world. At least that's what the people in his day believed. But Aristotle thought not so quick. That actually doesn't really work so well. Because we don't see anything that is an uncaused cause. We don't see anything being the first cause of all things. All that we see is an endless progression of cause and effect relationships. This caused this, which was caused by this, which was caused by this, which was caused by this. And we can follow it back, but we can't ever find the first cause inside of this material world.
And so let me illustrate like this. Just imagine if you walked into a room, and let's say the room is 10 foot by 10 foot. And when you open the door to the room, it's one where the door opens outward. And you open the door to the room, and you see 5 dominoes knock one another over. But these 5 dominoes are not the only dominoes in the room. You see 5 of them fall over right in front of you. But as you look into the room, you see that the room is full of dominoes that are in a sort of sequence line going back and forth, tracing around the room. And as you look at the dominoes, the 5 that you did see fall over, you see the 5th one back, you see that there's a domino laying on top of it. There's a domino laying on top of the one that was behind it, and another domino on top of the one behind it, all the way back into the room. And you can't see what's in the back of the room because it's dark back there. But what you did see was that the last 5 dominoes were the cause of each other knocking it over. In other words, the last domino that you see there, you saw it being knocked over by the second to last. The second to last, you saw it being knocked over by the third to last. The third to last, you saw it being knocked over by the fourth to last. And the fourth to last, you saw it being knocked over by the 5th to last. But you didn't see anything other than that. But what was it that knocked the 5th to last domino over? Well, it was the 6th to last. Well, what knocked it over? Well, the 7th to last. Well, what about the next one? The 8th to last. And so on and so on and so on and so on. But what was it that caused that very first domino to be knocked over? If we were to follow that line of dominoes all the way back, right? Because this domino fell because it was caused by the domino before it. And that domino fell because it was caused by the domino before it. And that domino fell because it was caused by the domino before it. And so on and so on and so on. All the way back to the first. But something that was not a domino had to knock down the first domino. It was the first cause. It was the only domino that was knocked over when it wasn't caused by another domino, by another domino there. So what was that? Who knows? You can't see the back of the room. The back of the room is dark. And the same sort of thing confounds Aristotle when it relates to the world around us. He can see all things having a cause. But what he can't see is he can't see behind that causation. He can't see that first cause. He can't even imagine what that first cause would be like. But he knows that by logical extension or logical inference, there has to be a first cause. And so he calls that first cause God. And the God of Aristotle is a non-personal God. God doesn't talk. It doesn't do miracles, isn't relatable to us as rational beings. Rather, God is the one who basically got things wound up and built and set it in motion and then left it to run on its own, the universe to run on its own. And according to Aristotle, that is God. God is the first cause, the unmoved mover, if you will, the source of all movement, the cause of all things, the first cause of all things. So that's his concept of God, which is kind of an interesting concept of God because this argument will be utilized later by, first of all, by Muslims at first, and then later on by Christians as well. And it's sort of modified and modified in both ways, but nonetheless, both groups will use this understanding of God. And they will develop it into what has become known as the cosmological argument for the existence of God. But God is this unmoved mover, this first cause. So that's Aristotle's understanding of God. Aristotle believes in the soul. He believes that the soul is the form of a human being. That the soul is what gives us meaning. The soul, if you see a body laying there and there's no soul in the body, then the body is dead. And so the body is the matter. The soul is that which is non-material but gives motion and gives volition to the body. It's the form of a human. It's what makes us human. A human without a soul is a body, a dead body. So that's what Aristotle would say. It's not even actually a human because it doesn't perform the function of a human. It may be a human body, but that's all it is. It's not actually a human. according to Aristotle. So the soul is the form of a human. It's what animates us. It's what gives us meaning. It's what makes us, it's that essential and necessary part of being a human. All right, so that's where Aristotle is on things like that, on meaning in axiology. As we delve a little bit deeper into his system of ethics, then Aristotle's system of ethics is recorded in his book. Well, it's a book now, known as the Nicomachean Ethics, and he's named this particular book after his son, Nicomacheus. So that's quite a name. If you're looking for names, if you are getting ready and expecting to have a child, and you're looking for names, maybe Nicomacheus would be a great name. Who knows? But Nicomachean ethics are a system of virtue ethics. And virtue ethics are a system or a type of ethical system that emphasizes character development rather than emphasizing the rightness or wrongness of particular actions. Now, most of your ethical theories are going to ask, are there moral principles? And if so, what are they? Well, virtue ethics says, well, it doesn't ask anything about moral principles. It says what kind of person would be the best kind of person in the most moral kind of person. And so we need to strive to be that sort of moral person. Now, so the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle is a system of virtue ethics. Now, virtue, the word, is not a word that we use too often anymore. Now, the word virtue is from an earlier age of our civilization, but so it warrants us to really define it, right? Now, a virtue is a quality of moral excellence. A quality of moral excellence. That's what a virtue is. When we say it's a quality of moral excellence, that means basically that there's something about us that could either be excellent or bad or worse, right? And a virtue is a character quality that we develop in order to become a more excellent person, a more virtuous person. Now, if we were to take this out of the realm of ethics for a minute, and we were to apply the concept of virtues to an automobile, we might ask ourselves, well, if I'm going to go look for an automobile, if I'm in the market for buying one, then what are the virtues of an automobile so that when I go to buy one, I can know what to look for? Now, different people will have they'll suggest different things. Some people might say, well, I want a sports car that's really fast, that looks really good, and that I can, so I can get to point A to point B in a fast and stylish way. So that's one thing that a person might consider a virtue: speed and style. Those might be virtues for one person. On the other hand, one might say, you know what, I drive a lot, and a virtue that I would look for in a car would be gas mileage and reliability, right? So that I can get from point A to point B with the least expenditure of money possible. So that would be a virtue of an automobile. So they would look at the gas mileage and that kind of thing. So that would be what that person would consider a virtue. Another person might go and look and say, well, I work on a farm and I need to be able to tow things that are really heavy. I need to be able to drive off-road, and I need to be able to haul things. So a pickup truck would be a virtuous automobile for that person. So what is considered a virtue about the automobile, if you're ever in the market for an automobile, really depends on what you want to use it for. So what I want you to see in that little illustration is that virtues are always related to purpose. Virtues are always related to purpose. And so in order to say that such and such is a virtuous thing, you have to have a purpose behind it. If this is going to be a virtuous automobile, well, I have to have a purpose in mind in order for it to be excellent for that purpose. So that's another thing about virtue. Virtues are always related to purpose. But the question then becomes this: if virtues are always related to purpose, what is the purpose of a person? What is the purpose of a person? If we say that a person is a virtuous person, well, we have to ask, virtuous for what? What is their purpose? And Aristotle believes, Aristotle believes that the main purpose of human beings is what he would call happiness. Happiness. Now, before we kind of look at that as a trite answer to what the purpose of human beings is, let's consider a few things first. First thing is this: for happiness, defined as Aristotle would define it, is not just this sort of glib feeling or emotion, the response that you have when certain circumstances and situations are working out in your favor. And so it's this light-hearted, skip through the village type of attitude, right? Well, that's not exactly what he has in mind when he refers to happiness. The word from which happiness is translated in the Greek is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. And eudaimonia really has a deeper meaning than just this light-hearted, joyous emotion that we might have in response to good circumstances. Happiness is basically the good life, if you will. Eudaimonia really refers to a happiness that is the state of a mind of someone who is experiencing the good life. Now, the good life, in the Greek concept, and particularly in Aristotle's concept, the Greek life really is one where a person should probably go out of their way to avoid extremes, because extremes are things that harm us, right? And so the good life is maximizing your pleasure and yet moderating it so as to minimize your pain, because you realize that if you all you do is go out and seek pleasure, that you're going to end up experiencing some pain. For example, I love devil's food chocolate cake. That is a very pleasurable thing for me to eat. But if I were to indulge myself at every turn with some devil's food chocolate cake, and I made that for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, before too long, all of that pleasure would result in me having the pain of a debilitated physical condition. My health would suffer tremendously, and eventually that would probably bring about an early demise for me if that's all I ever ate from now on for the rest of my life. So happiness is more than just seeking pleasure. It's maximizing your pleasure by moderating your pleasure in order to avoid pain. Another point, and this is important. This is where Aristotle parts ways with some others in his culture that might go a little bit more to extremes, and that's this: happiness, as Aristotle defines it, can only really be obtained if a person pursues it in a manner that is consistent with human nature. Let me say that again, and you can see it on the slide. But happiness can only be obtained when pursued in a manner that is consistent with human nature. If a human's going to be happy, then he can't go looking for happiness like a pig looks for happiness. I mean, if a pig goes and looks for happiness, they don't. As long as they've got some slop and some mud to roll around in, and maybe the sun to sun themselves, man, they're in hog heaven, literally. Right? They're loving it. They've fulfilled every part of them. But think about a human who went and did that. A human couldn't be happy rolling in the mud and laying out in the sun and eating slop. Why? Because a human is a human, and a human has different needs than a pig, because a human has a different nature than a pig. Therefore, humans have to look for happiness and pursue happiness in a manner that is consistent with their nature. Now, what is it that sets human beings apart, human nature apart from other animals? Well, we have a lot in common with other animals. We have a physical body, we have heart, we have lungs, or a manner of breathing. We have a brain, we have a pentadactyl pattern on our hands that is shared with most animals in the animal kingdom. And so what is it that separates us? Well, according to Aristotle, human nature, the thing that we need to operate and utilize in the pursuit of happiness, true happiness for humans, human nature includes the intellect, includes reason, includes wisdom. If we seek for happiness in a way that does not coincide or go alongside reason, then we will never find happiness. In other words, if we search for happiness like a pig or a dog searches for happiness,
we won't actually ever find it. Now, we might have some good times along the way, but ultimately we will not be fulfilled as a human can be fulfilled, because we have a different nature, and our nature includes the use of reason. And so we must use and exercise reason if we are truly to be happy as human beings. Now, human nature, if happiness is our purpose, and if we have to pursue happiness in a manner consistent with our nature, and if our nature includes reason, then we must develop virtues that relate to our reason. And so Aristotle believes that there are two different categories related to our reason that we need to develop virtues in if we're going to be a happy person, if we're going to pursue happiness. Those are the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues. The intellectual virtues and the moral virtues. Well, Aristotle, we could go on and explain, going deep into these intellectual virtues, some of the ones that he mentions there. These are character qualities that allow us to develop our intellect. For example, one character quality that would allow us to develop our intellect is personal discipline. Because studying takes personal discipline. You've got to be able to sit down, discipline yourself to sit down and study, whether it be reading or observation or experimentation, whatever the case may be. You've got to discipline yourself for that. And so personal discipline is a virtue that would allow us to develop our intellect. Also, in relationship to the intellectual virtues, honesty is an intellectual virtue. And the reason is because we need to be able to be intellectually honest, to admit when we're wrong, so that we can then search out for what the truth is. We will never find the truth if we just go around trying to confirm our own bias. So humility would be an intellectual virtue. Honesty is an intellectual virtue. And so Aristotle believes he has a whole list of them, things that help us to gain an intellect. Well, we'll set those aside now. That's another discussion maybe for another time. But what we're actually more interested in right now are the moral virtues, because this is a system of morals and ethics. Aristotle believes that there are certain moral virtues that we need to develop, character qualities that we need to develop if we as human beings are going to find happiness in a manner that is consistent with our reason. So these moral virtues, we need to find these moral virtues and make them part of our life. Well, how do we do that? Well, how do we identify moral virtues? How do we know what a virtue is and what it isn't? Aristotle explains that the way that we find virtue is that we use the golden mean. It's what he calls the golden mean. Now, the golden mean is the idea that the virtue is found between the excess of vice, the vice of excess and the vice of deficit. Let me say that again. Virtue is found between the vice of excess and the vice of deficit. So it's sort of a midway point, if you will. That's why he uses the term mean, like mean, median, mode. That's what he's talking about there. The middle point between two vices, the vice of excess and the vice of deficit. Now, we can see this by just looking at a character quality. For example, he believes that courage is a virtue. If a person, however, has too much courage, then that person is reckless, and that person is the kind of guy or girl that ends up on YouTube saying, "Hold my beer," and "Hey, y'all watch this," and then goes and does something stupid, thereby achieving internet fame, but probably also some sort of injury in the process. The vice of excess is recklessness is the vice of excess of courage. It's too much courage. A person who feels no fear. You see, because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage basically is the idea, or that we are able to continue on even in the face of fear. That we do not allow fear to paralyze us and determine what we do. And so that would be courage. That would be the virtue. But what would we call somebody who doesn't have, or who has too much fear? Who has too little courage, too much fear. What would we call somebody who has too little courage in order to face their fear? Fear does paralyze them. Fear does prevent them from doing things that would enrich their lives and so forth. Well, that person is a coward. that's a cowardly person, and that is a vice of deficit. It's a deficit of courage. So courage is in the middle. That's the virtue. The vice of excess is recklessness, and the vice of deficit is cowardice. It's being a coward. Another virtue that Aristotle considers is the virtue of self-control. The virtue of self-control. He would call it continence or something of that nature, but it's self-control, the ability to control oneself. Well, what if a person has too much self-control? Well, that person might be seen as stoic, or that person might be seen as somebody who just cannot be aroused to action. So that person is overly controlled and really just needs to let their hair down sometimes. That would be a vice of excess. But then there's people who have too little self-control, and those people might be considered to be impulsive. And they're the ones who are not dependable. They're all the time off doing some sort of new harebrained thing, whatever it is that they thought of in the morning. They have no self-control. They have no discipline. So that would be a vice of deficit. So the golden mean, according to Aristotle, is that virtue is found between the vice of excess and the vice of deficit. Okay, so if we've identified some virtues, how then do we develop those virtues? How do we build them into our lives so as to make them part of who we are, so that we can become virtuous people? Well, Aristotle believes that anybody can develop virtues, and that virtues are as easy to develop as simply any other practice. His idea is this: is that all virtue is habit. He believes that all virtue is habit. And you know how to get a habit, right? You just keep doing something until it becomes so ingrained that you can't not do it. And that's what a habit is. We develop bad habits all the time. What Aristotle suggests that we do is that we develop good habits. So how do we do that? Well, the first step in developing a good habit, a virtuous habit, the habit of virtue, is that we identify a virtuous role model. This could be somebody either real or imagined. It could be somebody that we know or somebody that we've read about. Basically, what we want to do is find a person who we know well enough to see or have access to their everyday life, and have access to some of their opinions and this kind of thing. And we want to, or at least what we imagine their opinions might be. And we need to identify them, and then what we do is we imitate that person. We ask ourselves, what would that person do? It's kind of like, years ago there was this big fad where people would wear bracelets that said WWJD, and it was the idea of what would Jesus do, and basically the idea is that when you get into a moral dilemma, you just look down at your bracelet and you ask yourself, what would Jesus do in this situation? And then you do whatever Jesus would do. Well, that's sort of what Aristotle is getting at with this virtue ethics. He's saying, look, what would your role model do? Now, your role model may not be Jesus, but your role model is somebody you've chosen who's virtuous. What would that individual do in a moral situation where their morals are being challenged? What would that person do if they were faced with danger? What would that person do if they had this opportunity and had to make this decision, and so on? And if you believe that person to be a virtuous person, and they exemplify those virtues that you have figured out using the golden mean, then basically pattern your life after them, and you imitate them as your role model, and you continue to do that until virtue becomes just second nature. It's a habit. So you identify a virtuous role model, you imitate that role model until virtue becomes habit. And that is Aristotle's understanding of how to be a virtuous person, how to develop virtue in your life. Well, we've had a lot to look at in this video. Aristotle is a wide-ranging, very versatile philosopher. He's written on a number of things that are still even relevant today, or at least worthy of our consideration today. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your interest. Make sure that you do the reading that is assigned in the syllabus, and then we will see you in the next session. Alrighty, thank you.